Hello, listeners and viewers. I have an interesting story for you today. It's one of Canada's most fascinating UFO cases. It happened in a quiet Saskatchewan field in September of 1974. While working his family's canola fields, Edwin Fuhr came face to face with something extraordinary: five metallic saucers hovering silently above the ground. And when they departed, they left behind more than just questions. Donut-shaped disturbances in the grass, which to a modern eye would look as rudimentary versions of crop circles. But back in 1974, that term nor that phenomenon was yet born. But what makes this case so fascinating isn't just the physical evidence left behind. It's that it was taken seriously, both in the form of an RCMP investigation as well as a scientific analysis by the National Research Council, both of which were unable to explain what Edwin saw that day. But what is for sure is that Edwin nor the RCMP officer have wavered in their story whatsoever, despite the passage of nearly 50 years. This is a story with many layers of details, and we're going to try to explore all of it, so make yourself comfortable. In this episode, I'm going to be joined by leading Canadian UFO researcher Chris Rutkowski, and together we're going to be discussing the story of Edwin Fuhr and the 1974 Langenburg, Saskatchewan UFO incident. Now, before we get started, let me also invite you to take these stories with you via the Nighttime podcast. You can hear a full-length version of this episode and many more fascinating Canadian stories by subscribing to the Nighttime podcast wherever you get podcasts or at nighttimepodcast.com. Let's get into it.
You are listening to the Nighttime podcast.
We were shocked.
Leo Fuhr remembers the unexplainable sighting like it was yesterday. In the morning of September 1st, 1974, his brother Edwin Fuhr reported seeing five silver flying saucers hovering in his canola field, leaving behind what looked like donut-shaped imprints before taking off into the sky.
Oh, I thought, well, what the heck, maybe my brother was seeing things and that. But until I saw the rings, seeing is believing.
Those mysterious circles thrust the tiny town of Langenburg, Saskatchewan in the spotlight, drawing international news coverage and UFO enthusiasts from around the world. A story compelling enough for the federal government to test soil samples and an RCMP investigation, but resulting in no conclusions.
Chris Rutkowski, it's been too long since I had you on the show. How are you doing on your side of the country?
Very well, Jordan.
For people new to the show, where are you and who are you?
I am in the real center of Canada, in Winnipeg, in Manitoba, just north of that Minnesota bump that's everybody sees on the maps. And I'm Chris Rutkowski. I've been at the whole UFO thing since the mid-1970s, so I'm extremely, extremely old. I've been around investigating some cases for quite some time.
Yeah, and in fact, the case we're going to be talking about now, and this actually it gave me a bit of a realization about how long you've been doing it for. We're going to be talking about a case from 1974. I've been going back, reading everything I could that's been written about this case, and the amount of times your name comes up is amazing. And and like going way back to junior Chris Rutkowski getting into this.
Yeah, I mean, I never investigated the case originally. 1974, I had just started, I guess. I was in high school and I was doing a little bit of, looking at reading up and talking to people about UFOs. I actually didn't start investigation until the year after, in 1975. But after that point, I went out to Langenburg. I've spoken to the witness a number of times, found all sorts of records. I've talked to all the main investigators. So it's a very interesting case, and I think it's worthwhile for people to know about it because it's one of the classics.
It is one of the classics. When you think of the big Canadian cases, do you consider the Langenburg case, on that list of like the five, let's say, big Canadian UFO cases?
Oh, absolutely, because it was investigated by the RCMP.
Yeah.
We have the RCMP files. It was one of the cases that the Royal Canadian Mint created a coin to commemorate because it was part of our culture, and certainly in that part of Saskatchewan, it is part of that culture.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very good case and has a lot of the elements that you really need for a meaty UFO case.
And this got it. So let's get into it here. I think most people listening, including probably a lot of people from that part of the country, are probably unfamiliar about Langenburg, Saskatchewan. I had never heard of it outside of the context of this story. Have you ever visited this place during your investigation into this case, or have you ever been near Langenburg?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've driven through to Langenburg and back and forth a couple of times. It's kind of halfway between Winnipeg and Regina, or Winnipeg and Saskatoon, close to the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border. Not really close, but relatively close there. And it's in a very flat part of the country. Lots of grain out that way. A lot of canola,
Mhm.
and
And that'll play into our story tonight. And
absolutely,
a
yeah.
very small kind of agricultural community. I think a population hovering just over 200 people when this happened
Yeah.
back in 74. So this is a tiny little spot. And the fella at the heart of it, Edwin Fuhr, is like a lifelong resident and lifelong farmer in Langenburg. So you have this kind of like small little community that is probably best known for this UFO incident.
Right. His family, had been running that farm before him, and his brother-in-law took over from him, and so it is a small, close-knit community.
And you said you got into the UFO topic a little bit after this happened in 1974. I understand that this is one of those cases where there was a bit of a media slash onlooker kind of craze that took over Langenburg. Were you around for any of that, like at a period of time where people were kind of descending on this town to figure out what was going on?
Well, and again, not at the time, but because it had this reputation, people were very familiar with it and visited it even after the fact. In fact, one thing that's notable about this case is that some people have attributed it to the first crop circles.
Hmm.
Um, and as a matter of fact, there in 77, so just 3 years later, there were a series of crop circles or circles that they weren't even called crop circles but in 1977, but circles that were found in grain not too far away from Langenburg in a Manitoba town called Rossburn, which we did investigate. I and my colleagues did investigate that. And the comparisons were made between that and Langenburg, since they were just a matter of several dozen kilometers or miles away.
Interesting. Yeah, and that's an important part of the story because now when you think of like UFO sightings and appearances, crop circles they're just a part of that. But this predates crop circles, yet what we think of now as a crop circle plays a prominent role in the evidence that this actually happened. And I think that's important as well because when you think of a story like this and you're trying to gauge truthfulness and exaggeration, when you hear and it left a crop circle, you're like, yeah, of course it did, buddy. But in 1974, when this happened, that was, this is pre-X Files, pre-crop circles popping up everywhere. So it's an important feature of that. And another important feature of this, I think, is the fact that from 1974 until present day, it seems that everyone involved in the story has told the same story consistently.
Yeah, yeah. Fuhr never really embellished the story at all. He told the story same thing over and over again, many many times. Didn't add in other features, like windows or antennas or
Mhm.
little green guys or gray guys or anything like that. It's remained fairly consistent, and and as a matter of fact, back then they weren't talking, before crop circles, these were called landing rings, which had been found before in a number of places around the world. As a matter of fact, not too far from here, there had been some in western Manitoba that were found in 1967, but also 1967, the UFO rings, and they were called UFO rings, were found in Alberta, in Duhamel, Alberta, investigated by the Canadian Air Force. in 1967 as well. So I mean, there was this connection, but this was something that was apart from that and had its own characteristics.
Mhm. And one last thing to say about Edwin is, aside from maintaining his story consistently from when this happened until present day, I don't think anyone could ever make a case for him having tried to profit off of this. There's no books that he wrote or, anything that he's done where you'd be like, like this guy's full of it.
Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police report by Ron Morier, there's a line here that's actually quite interesting. It says the witness Fuhr has been known by a member of this detachment, so known to the RCMP, for a period of 4 years, and during this time he has not been known to materialize any such crazy stories. He is a responsible person, and his information is considered reliable. So
Mm.
that's from the RCMP, who lived and worked in the community and knew the Fuhr family.
Yeah, and
So,
and I think as we listen, we're going to learn that the person who's giving that character analysis of Edwin is likely a supervisor with the RCMP. Because I'm going to play a clip as we go concerning the RCMP investigation into this, and there's going to be references made to the fact that Edwin was well known by a supervisor with the
mhm,
RCMP in the area. But
absolutely.
yeah, interesting. But let's get into it and talk about the sighting, what he saw, how he came to see it, what he's seen. It begins with him working in a canola field on what looked to me to be like a combine, like the big tractor that you drive through the field that um, actually I don't even know what it does. It just cuts the hay, I guess, and puts it
It's
in balls.
a swather, not a combine,
What
actually.
is the difference? Do you know? I'm here on the
Well,
East Coast. We're all fishing. Where you are,
well,
you're in.
the swather is actually the thing that cuts the plants themselves.
Okay.
The combine actually does a few other things, but the swather is basically the machine that cuts it.
It has,
Yeah.
yeah, it looks like a tractor with like this big long kind of wheel sort of thing that's spinning and
Yeah,
chopping.
yeah.
But regardless, he's a 36-year-old man at this point, driving through the field, processing the canola, which for someone unfamiliar, it basically looks like a wheat field that he's driving around
Yeah.
in. And what's interesting about the field that he's working in is there's kind of a lowland area where there's a swampy, boggy sort of area. So as he's cutting the canola or the hay or whatever you want to call it, the grass, he's driving towards that swampy area, the lowland area, and he notices something unusual. And that's where it begins. It's described by him initially as looking almost like metallic saucer-like objects. In several of them, I believe he sees just one at first, and he believes it to be like a goose hunting blind
Mhm.
initially. Does that make any sense to you? I've never seen, like, when I think of a blind for hunting, it's usually like, this little lean-to next to a tree that you can hide behind. Yeah, any
Well,
reason that he would say that? Do you know any more than I do?
I think because he was having trouble understanding what it was. Yeah, he was swathing the field, and right around this swampy area is some tall grass,
Mhm.
and he got to the edge of the tall grass, where he was cutting, and that's when he saw these upside down bowls, or one bowl to start with. And the reason he thought it was a duck blind or a hunter's blind was because he could not, figure it out. Now, some blinds are actually made out of tin, depending on where they go and where they put them. Um, and I think they're even inflatable now or something like
Hmm.
that. But at that time he couldn't understand what it was, and he thought, well, that must be what it is, because it was these this was in the grass, so between the crop and the actual water in the swamp, there's this tall grass, and that's where this thing was.
Mhm. And he sees it, he approaches it, coming within about 15 feet of it, and that's when he realizes that this is not, a geese or a duck hunting blind. This is a metallic object that's actually hovering off of the ground a little over a foot, and it's not still. The way he's described it, and we'll hear from him shortly, but he describes it as the object very quickly spinning in one direction, where the grain or the crop underneath it is kind of being propelled in the opposite direction. So some kind of weird physics happening there. And an interesting part of this is almost any time I've heard him describe this, it seems like he's there for a pretty good amount of time just staring at it. And he describes as almost feeling like he's been welded to the ground, unable to move, just taking this in. In fact, let's hear from him now. I'm going to play a short clip of Edwin describing what he had seen in the field.
Well, I was scared at the time when I was sitting there because I was only 15 feet from him, and I didn't know what it was. You know, I thought it was somebody that was hunting, had a goose blind, because it was a very shiny machine, and it was turning. It was about 15 inches off the ground, and you could see right underneath through it. And I thought to myself, I just wonder what the hell this could be. And you sure as heck, you couldn't walk up to it because you froze. I sat there, and I thought, well, gee whiz, you know, I kept looking at my time. It's getting later and later, and they wouldn't move. They just sat there. And every time I figured I should walk a little closer, I couldn't. I was just like, I was welded to the ground. It lit up the whole north end of town. Like the sky was all lit up. There was 3 machines. There was 3 big ones and 2 small ones, and they were flanking the 3 big ones in the center. And they were from 30 feet in diameter to 35 feet in diameter.
As we said there before I played that clip, he approaches the one object, but very soon, very quickly after that, he realizes there's several of them together. Can you kind of describe, you sent me before we started here, kind of an illustration of the area and what he witnessed. Can you describe the scene as it eventually unfolded to him?
Sure. As I mentioned, there's this tall grass surrounding the slough, which is just, and then surrounded by the canola field. And he got as close as he could on his tractor. He actually said in another interview that he stood up on the seat of the tractor to see if he could actually get a better view, because these things were, you know, partly hidden by the plants. But he was as close as he wanted to get or could get, because, you know, he was so shocked and so amazed by what he saw there that, you know, he was 15 or so feet away. And he just couldn't understand what he was looking at. And there were 3 big ones and a couple of small ones, sort of in an arc surrounding this slough. Incidentally, a few days later, 2 others were found as well. But the initial were just these 5, and they were spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. And he could see that the plants underneath them were being agitated or blown around as well.
And then after spending an amount of time there, as it's been described, it was like almost like a burst of vapor from underneath them, and they just took off like with a blink of an eye.
Yeah, he said that, well, not quite that. They took off to a certain extent. They ascended in a step formation into the overcast sky, so one after another. And this is from the RCMP report. They stopped at about 200 feet. So they went up one by one, stopped at a certain height. Puff of dark gray vapor was seen coming from the exhaust-like extensions at the base of each of the objects. The vapor was 6 feet in length and was followed by a downward gust of wind, which almost knocked his hat off and flattened the canola that was standing in the immediate area, and they had remained stationary at that point for a couple of minutes. So they went up one by one, were there for a little bit while, and then when they went, they were gone. That was it.
Interesting. The story really picks up when the objects, as he calls the machines, every clip I've heard of him or interview with him, he's never referring to them as like spaceships or UFOs. He's always saying the machines. But when the machines leave, he goes back to his house. It's around supper time at this point, and people in the home with him, his wife specifically, noticed something unusual about him. And I'm going to play a clip of his wife Karen as well, because she spoke to the media and described realizing something was wrong with Edwin after this moment.
Okay.
We were waiting and waiting for him to come. We had dinner on the table waiting for him, and when he came in, he just kind of sat there. He didn't really know if he should eat or what he should do, and then all of a sudden we asked him, is there something wrong? And well, then he started telling us. I just thought, well, if he'd seen him, he's seen him, you know. I didn't go out to the field right away that day. I went out the next day first to look at them, the circles.
They were worried. They were they were concerned because this was completely uncharacteristic. He came in and he was sitting there. By some of the interviews, they said that he looked kind of pale and clammy
Uh,
and was noticeably upset,
hmm.
as you would be if you had seen,
Not a lot happens in Langenburg, so I think
no,
these
no, yeah.
bizarre objects in your field is definitely going to put a scare into you. He gets home, that whole experience happens. He tells them what he saw, and that's when this story really gets interesting. And this is perhaps one of the aspects of it that make this such a classic Canadian UFO case. Is it's not Edwin or his wife, but I think it's his brother-in-law that phones the police.
Yeah, his brother-in-law, Carl Zorn, says, this is very strange. We should notify the authorities. And so he contacts the RCMP, and they were fairly good friends with a fellow named Ron Morier,
Mm.
who was the constable at the time. And that's when the story started breaking.
Yeah, you're someone who goes through, fair to say, almost every Canadian UFO sighting and UFO report. Is it common that you will get access to like RCMP investigation or RCMP or police reports related to UFO sightings? Like how often do they actually go there and investigate if you call the police and say there's something in the sky in my backyard?
Well, as a matter of fact, just before coming on with you today, I've been going through files from the National Research Council from Ottawa. I was in Ottawa looking in the National Archives, going through cases from the early 1990s. And I would say out of 150 cases a year on average, I would say a handful, five or six, have detailed RCMP investigations, interviews, descriptions of which constable went out and what they saw and what they heard and that type of thing. So it's not very common at all, and we're very fortunate that with such a case with such great evidence, we have a case where the RCMP took the case seriously, took the witnesses seriously, and investigated the site. And we have the
Mhm.
documentation, including some great photographs, by the way, of what was seen. So, this case has a lot of good evidence.
And just as the eyewitness himself, Edwin Fuhr, is a big part of this story, the RCMP officer who investigated it, this became a large part of his identity throughout life as well. He was like, when X-Files became big, he was referred to by some of his coworkers as Mulder because he had this reputation of having investigated a UFO report and been on the news and such. I'm going to play a clip here, and we'll focus a little bit on his police report he did back in '74. But here's an interview with him, retired now RCMP officer Ray Morin, where he's describing his memories of responding to this event.
Yeah.
Take notes because we're going to compare this to his 1974 police report when we wrap this up.
You were a 27-year-old RCMP constable. What do you remember from that day 50 years ago?
I remember pulling up to the office at the end of my shift on the 1st of September, and Carl Zorn, who's a brother-in-law to Edwin, approached the police car, and Carl lived right next door to the office, and he kind of related the story about what Edwin had seen. And I went and advised my supervisor what was going on, and from that I went out to the farm and did an investigation. But my memory tells me that I didn't go out until the following day, following morning. I pulled into Mr. Fuhr's yard. He's north of Langenburg at the time, north of Mid East, and spoke to him, and he told me the story. And with him, we went out to the area on his field where he had seen these objects. And I had the camera with me, and I had some vials for taking soil samples, and that's what I did. I took pictures, and they were very plain to see that what he described was as it was. And I also took some grass and dirt samples in vials. I sent them off to the National Research Center in Ottawa as per our policy. There's firm policy on what we do with stuff like that, and I just followed the policy and mailed them off, and never got anything back, really. Back in those days, it was pretty secretive, all this UFO stuff. It was kind of all under wraps. And
Did you believe Edwin?
I didn't know Edwin that well. My supervisor knew him quite well. Edwin was a very reliable individual, not prone to telling stories, not prone to wanting a lot of attention. Just a regular salt of the earth fella. And I believe that Edwin, in his mind, saw what he saw, and there was proof out there backing up what he claims he saw. You know, especially the circles, they were quite intriguing. How I think somebody described them as kind of like donuts. The grass was all flattened in one direction, and in the middle it was standing. So there was a lot of pressure coming from the rim of whatever these objects were, for sure, to flatten the grass like that. And the canola was high enough that you would have seen tracks from a vehicle, or even somebody walking through would have left some kind of indication that that they were in there. But I do believe that whatever came into that field came from above and left in the same manner.
So that's fascinating to hear a retired RCMP's officer's account of that, because it seems like he has no doubt in Edwin's version of the story, and it seems he's mystified as well. Whatever did this to the grass came from above and left the same way. I think that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, I spoke with Ron Maury a couple of times back then. And it's interesting, his account really, many years later, didn't vary that much from his original RCMP report. It was all in there. He didn't go out until the next day, because by the time that he had actually been out, after getting the phone call from Carl Zorn, it was already starting to get dark, and it made sense to wait until the next morning. And he took samples, and he does talk about a protocol, the procedure manual, all this sort of stuff. A lot of that came from the earlier marks in the ground, the UFO marks and the landing marks from 1967, which is at that time was just 7 years earlier. So it was still relatively fresh, and so the RCMP had been involved in earlier cases, so it made sense that they would have some sort of policy on
So he, by the sounds of it, what he did for his investigation was take photographs, take soil samples. He sent that off to the National Research Council.
Right.
Doesn't seem like he gets any information back, though. Like, are you aware of this investigation going anywhere beyond what he just described as taking the samples and sending it off? Because he does as well say things were very secret and hush-hush back then.
Well, it's hard to tell whether it was hush-hush or simply that they didn't really have the competence to do it. In reading the RCMP and the National Research Council files, the RCMP were the investigators for the National Research Council, which had an interest, and they were tasked with investigating or keeping track of the UFOs in Canada. They were based in Ottawa, and they needed people across Canada to do their dirty work for them, the legwork. So the RCMP were actually commissioned to investigate on behalf of the National Research Council. But because the National Research Council of Canada itself, they didn't have all the expertise necessary to do a thorough investigation. They could rely on a few labs here and there. So the extent of the National Research Council's investigation itself was pretty limited. And I did see at one point some results of the analysis. I did see a radioactive analysis of the site, and it was not radioactive. That was done by somebody at the time. So the soil samples were looked at by a couple of laboratories, but the investigation didn't go much further. And what could they do? There wasn't much to investigate. The UFOs, the machines, the saucers, they were gone. There was nothing to investigate except these marks, and there was no way that anybody could figure out how these marks were created. There were some explanations after the fact that maybe these were some sort of probably off a disease of the plants themselves. That was actually suggested by a skeptic and a debunker, but that doesn't make any sense. But we don't know exactly how these things were made, and that was the extent of the
Yeah.
investigation.
If you were to believe that this was like a disease of the grass, then you would also need to believe that Edwin noticed these strange, donut-shaped disturbances in the grass and made up the rest of the story and convinced his, brother-in-law to phone the RCMP. And yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But in the RCMP's police report, we both have copies there. But do you know does he go on to explain any of the physical characteristics or measurements of these donut-shaped disturbances in the grass?
Oh yeah, in fact, there's some detailed measurements of the rings. The grass was flattened in a clockwise, with the flattened portion being approximately 18 inches. So they were donuts, right? The total diameter of two of the circles was 12 feet, with the other three being approximately 10.5 feet. So there were, some big ones and some small
And that
ones.
matches Edwin's report where there was the three larger machines and the two smaller ones on each side. I've heard him describe it as they seem to be guarding. The three larger ones were kind of together,
Flanking
flanking them, yeah.
flanking them.
So it's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
in like a half moon sort of shape as they were kind of surrounding that swampy, grassy area. The indentations in the ground leaving it a donut shape. Like I don't.
Well, if they were bowls, obviously they were hollow in the center, or so that's how you ended up with a donut shape. They weren't flat. They actually had bowls or something like
Yeah,
that.
and he described like the way he describes them leaving, there is some exhaust, so some kind of propulsion from below. So I guess, without knowing what these things were, what must have been happening is whatever was powering them to float 15 inches ish off the ground was disturbing the grass, which is like it all just kind of lines up. And I think that's very fascinating. And the fact that he's been consistent, it matches the RCMP police report. The RCMP officer today still tells the same story that he wrote on that report, 50 years ago. That's
Mhm.
compelling. When you look into a UFO case, is that I can't imagine you're not trying to rule out that the witness is making this up. Is this the stuff you're looking for, like the consistency in the story?
Yeah, and as Morier had said, he was thinking, how could people get into the area, to make these things? There was no tracks, no marks. In the case of crop circles, for example, in England, that took another decade to show up. Um, there were these tracks across the field where people could walk in and make them if they wanted to. But this was very different. There was nothing in the canola field itself to indicate people had come in. And then to get into this area where the tall grass was, you would definitely have seen some signs of people going in there.
Hmm. So the incident happens. RCMP respond, investigate, take the soil samples, photos, send that off to the National Research Council. Somehow the media gets involved, and it seems like there's a bit of a circus, at least temporarily. I haven't been able to figure out how the media became privy to this happening, but maybe it's just a symptom of a small town noticing cops showing up at the Fuhr farm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was, word of mouth works really, really well. And eventually somebody, probably somebody from the Yorkton paper or the Yorkton radio station probably heard about this, and somebody came out, and then it was all over the whole area for
Mhm.
sure.
Uh, all over the whole area to the point that people were trying to get on the field to approach the donut-shaped remnants that were there. Edwin's father, who owned the farm at this point, he wanted to deter people from coming and going on the property. He actually went as far as to burn the grass to, hide any remnants of it after the fact. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I found a couple reports
Yeah,
of him
yeah.
trying to burn the grass and having difficulty even destroying the evidence of this.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was very common back then to burn some of the remnants from fields over the years. That's how you renew some of the crops. Because this was in grass and not crop itself. It was a different consistency. and you can burn it. But of course, the grass is, the grass was pressed down in a circle. So even after you burn it, you can still see where it is. And people were very curious. They were trampling through the area, damaging the crop itself. And we see this in other areas. I mean, this is one concern in England with the crop circles. There were in the circles in Rossburn. When we went out there, there was actually at one of the circles that we visited in Rossburn, I think near Shoal Lake, there were some kids standing outside a path leading into the circle with a sign that said "A loony a look." You had to pay them to get inside to to get a look of the crop circle. So I mean, it's a way of everybody was interested in seeing this remarkable thing, because this was actually fairly unique, even in terms of ufology. The what was reported was very different from what people had been seeing in the news and in the tabloids and so forth. It's not very common to have seen something like this. And when word gets around that Edwin had seen these upside down bowls leaving marks in the ground, everybody and their dog wanted to see.
Years later, when crop circles became like one of the tropes of the UFO world, was this story brought up again? Like, I'm surprised that it's not more well known as being kind of like one of the grandfathers of the crop circle cases.
No, as a matter of fact, the British crop circles were supposedly started, by themselves, and it took some time in correspondence with some of the crop circle experts in Britain, where I actually pointed out to them a couple of times that we've had reports from all around the world, but especially in Canada, the ones in Duhamel, Alberta, and the ones at Rossburn and so forth. Even in Australia in 1966, very similar actually, where what were called saucer nests were found in a swamp with the reeds cut in a circular fashion. That was 66. So there are precedents like this, and just a matter of people accepting that they were related somehow to the crop circles. The difference is nobody saw UFOs make the crop circles, but in the case of Australia in 66, in the case of Edwin Fuhr's example, this was associated as a UFO caused item.
I see you as an expert in taking these often bizarre stories and coming up with a solution that just makes sense and that's reasonable. If this isn't aliens coming down and investigating the swamp on a canola field in rural Saskatchewan, what could this be?
If it isn't an alien or an Air Force experiment or something like that, it would be a hoax. And we don't really have all the elements of a hoax here. You mentioned already, Edwin wasn't trying to make any money from this. They tried to keep people away. He could have gone right to the paper rather than to the RCMP and said, look, we saw these saucers. But that's not what happened. In fact, he was a very reluctant UFO witness at the best of times, and his family and friends attested to the fact that he was really upset. He was, clammy. This had really, affected his belief system. These things don't exist, and yet I saw this. So it is quite remarkable. So if it wasn't anything like that, and how, why hoax it there? Why not closer to a road so people can have easier access?
Yeah. And again, where crop circles or like the UFO nests or any of this stuff, it wasn't a big trope then, that if you were going to, if this was a hoax, I believe it was somebody hoaxing Edwin and like tricking him. If you were going to mess with the farmer Edwin while he's working, what would compel someone in 1974 to be like, well, mess with the grass and make donut-shaped holes, and he'll think,
yeah, exactly. I mean,
he at the same time will maybe hallucinate and see these objects and get close to, like, it would have to be a hoax mixed with him having like a psychotic break.
Well, yeah, it could be somebody was trying to punk him, but back then that wasn't all that common to do stuff like that on a grand scale. And again, what was the purpose? I mean, he did go back to farming. He didn't, what's the point of punking if you don't come out and say, ha ha,
Yeah,
you gotcha.
And also, And also, this story is well known now, but if somebody did punk him, they couldn't have anticipated that he would contact the RCMP and that the RCMP would show up. So the joke, like, there's no punchline to that joke. It's an elaborate trick that goes nowhere if it is a
Yeah,
hoax, which leads me to think this can't be a hoax. It wouldn't make any
yeah.
sense.
But then if it's not a hoax, then we have to go somewhere else, and that gets really tricky.
Yeah, it is tough. And I think that's why this is such a mystery. You have a believable witness, you have a set of circumstances that isn't easily explained. Like we're two creative guys. I can't come up with any explanation whatsoever. And I believe him. I've seen multiple interviews. And in fact, the earliest interview I listened to was one you did, a young Chris Rutkowski. What is the history of this interview you have with Edwin way back in the day?
Yeah, this comes from 1991. And again, fairly early in my career, I just started doing the Canadian UFO report, which we, in 1989. But I was, interested in this. And what had happened was, many people in ufology are familiar with an organization called the Center for UFO Studies. It used to be actually the number one UFO group. You didn't join MUFON or APRO necessarily. If you really wanted to do something cool, you would join QFOS. And QFOS had a unique thing where they worked with law enforcement. QFOS actually had sent out little stickers to all the law enforcement offices, sheriff's offices, RCMP, and so forth, to put on their phones so that if they got a call about a UFO, they could call QFOS and they would send out investigators. And QFOS did send out investigators, such as Mark Roediger, Jerry Clark in some cases. And one of the other people involved was a fellow named John Timmerman. Now, John was a very dedicated ufologist. He wrote a book called Grassroots UFOs, which is really one of the great books on UFOs that's very badly underrated. But one of the things that John Timmerman did is that after he retired, he had an opportunity to travel around North America with an exhibit about UFOs. And QFOs originally in Chicago, they had an exhibit that they would put up in shopping malls and whatever, about UFOs, for the public to understand more about UFOs. They later installed it in a building in Minneapolis, where they thought it was going to be permanent, but they had to move it out of there. And so John actually took it around the country, and visited various shopping malls. Literally took UFO exhibits to shopping malls. And one of the malls he set up was in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. And along the way, John Timmerman would interview UFO witnesses and interesting people. And they're just now discovering a lot of the interviews that John had done. The tapes are being made available, and people are downloading them and digitizing them, and they're quite interesting. And there was an interview that he did when I heard that Timmerman was coming to Yorkton, which it's 4 hours away from Winnipeg, not too far away from where I am, and I wanted to meet him, and I was a member of QFOS. So I drove over there, and one of the things he did, he wanted to meet Edwin Fuhr, so he caught a hold of Edwin Fuhr. Fuhr actually came to the shopping mall, and we actually interviewed Edwin Fuhr together, and that's a recording that we have on YouTube.
That is what a time to be alive. See, I often say the internet and cell phones destroyed humanity. We don't have things like that, like a traveling mall roadshow interviewing UFO people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what John Timmerman had is now in St. Paul, Alberta, at the UFO Museum in St. Paul, Alberta. So, things are continually available, but they're out there.
Now, getting back to Edwin Fuhr's family and the firm, they still own, maintain, and farm canola on that same farm. Is there any kind of memorial or any kind of anything to indicate that this has happened either at their farm or in that area of Saskatchewan? Are you familiar with anything?
I don't think there's anything that sort of points to it anymore. At one point, there was some discussion about in one of the stores in the town or something like that. They would have a poster or something mentioning it, or a write-up. But other than that, it's sort of faded from history. In fact, I think the members of the family that run it now, don't really know the story at all. And yet
Mhm.
it's so well documented, one of the better documented cases of UFOs.
Yeah, and I do know that the RCMP officer Ron Morier has maintained like a binder of
Yes.
clippings and documents and stuff. So I think that is so we have the coin that commemorates it, and we have his binder, and I think those two things are about what's necessary to keep this story going.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm surprised people still talk about it nowadays, though. With the RCMP having investigated, photos of the event are still online, or photos of the donut-shaped indentation, and the fact that it can't easily be explained. I think this is going to be one of those cases that'll always be associated with UFO sightings in Canada.
Yeah, and if you're an ardent debunker and skeptic, you'll just say it was a hoax, and we don't know how it was hoaxed, but it was hoaxed so well we haven't solved it yet. But I think a true believer will say this is, it's evidence of something a little bit greater than us.
Whenever I have you on the show, I like to end with something special. I have a spot on nighttimepodcast.com where people can share with me UFO sightings. I have a pretty good one, and I'm curious of your take on this. I got a UFO report from Binbrook, Ontario, which is near Hamilton, just outside of Toronto.
Okay.
It's a fella named Chris wants to tell us about a UFO or something unusual he saw in the sky. I can't explain this one either. Maybe you can. This comes from early February. February 1st of this year, 2025, is when this happened.
Okay.
So it's about 3 weeks ago. Tell me if you can solve this one today.
First of all, not sure what I saw. I live in Binbrook, Ontario, Canada. In the western sky, when I came out, I'm always looking up. I know the stars, satellites. It's always clear where I'm living outside of the big city. I saw what I thought was a fast-moving satellite. I'm like, why is that going so fast? And then I saw another one come on the same line behind it, traveling from west to east, and it caught up to it at an outstanding speed. When it caught it, it slowed. They both turned south, then disappeared. Then on the same line the first one came across the sky west to east, easily 10 times faster than a normal satellite. When it got to that spot, it disappeared. At least 6 more followed. Possibly more. I had stopped to yell for my kids to come out and see. Then, unbelievably, in the same spot, one appears. The spot where they disappeared, one appears and starts traveling south, much slower than the rest. It gets super bright, and then it stops and hovers in one spot, and then it takes off, gone. Very frustrated because there's nowhere to report, no one to tell in Canada, nowhere to phone. I saw this previous Saturday night, sometime between 7 and 9. I'm not exactly sure. We were doing family game night. I wasn't keeping track of time. This definitely needs somebody to explain what the heck I saw. If there's human technology, there can't be humans inside of that. That was going way faster than satellites. I don't think satellites chase each other or catch up to each other. And I know they don't turn left or right.
So I got him in touch with the expert. If anyone can explain it, it's Chris Rutkowski. Now, I'll tell you my thoughts on this.
Sure.
Is when you're describing multiple objects kind of passing in a path, you think of the Starlink satellite array, which it often manifests itself and comes up in reports as a series of lights.
Right.
But so that's what I'm thinking as I'm listening. But he's describing them kind of stopping, some changing directions, some going faster than others. So that I'm like, maybe not Starlink. What's your take on this? What could he have seen?
Well, I mean, first of all, he was complaining that there is no place in Canada to report these things. Well, there is you.
Yeah, he came to the right place.
This is the
right
right
now,
place.
we're about as good as we got.
Yeah, and the Sky Canada project, one of the recommendations is to have an office to report things in Canada, and so we'll see what happens in the new political climate. But the it's still possible that some of what he was seeing was Starlink. It's possible that he was seeing a combination of Starlink and other things. What happens often when you suddenly see a satellite or a star-like object appear and get brighter and vanish, it's a flare caused by a satellite going in and out of the Earth's shadow, high in the sky because of the orientation and stuff. And in terms of the objects following one another, that does sound like Starlink, and it could just simply be an illusion that one disappeared and the other one zoomed off, and then two others went south. It could be a combination of things, that things were coming in and out of the Earth's shadow that he couldn't see. I mean, we do get reports like this of lots of lights moving in the sky backwards and forwards and right angle turns and all that sort of stuff. It's hard to say. I don't know specifically of this case. We'd have to look into it to see what the records are. There are cases that don't seem to match satellites, that don't seem to match, high altitude aircraft doing that type of thing. What those are, I don't know. So, it's the type of thing where we need to get more data and more information. And it's what keeps us going in terms of trying to understand what it is that people are reporting as UFOs or UAP.
As an investigator, if you were going to investigate, what would be the source? Like, what would you want to get to try to understand it? Would it be, of course, you would probably look at if the Starlink satellites were, passing over Ontario on Saturday, February 1st during this time.
Yeah, you'd have to have things like an accurate determination of time down to the minute, an accurate direction in the sky, because depending on where you're looking, and a few degrees one way or another would be certainly a problem. So you'd have to match that with a program like Heavens Above, which tracks Starlink and other satellites. It could have been any other series of satellites too.
And then where he's pretty close to Toronto, you're going to have to look at air traffic, because there's going to be a whole lot of it.
Yeah, FlightAware. You have to get a subscription to a good FlightAware program to go back in time to when this was, and see what flights there were. And there's lots of flights that aren't recorded on FlightAware. If there's no transponder, sometimes a military aircraft won't be there. So it's in some cases impossible to determine exactly what was seen.
Mm-hmm. But I think by the sounds of it, your big takeaway from this call specifically is him expressing his frustration with seeing this and wanting to share it and have it investigated, and having no other options other than getting it to me. And fortunately, I got it to Canada's best guy.
Best guys, you and me.
Okay, yeah, sure, team. But yeah, this is a fascinating story of the 1974 Langenburg UFO incident. I've always wanted to learn more about it, and getting to read it, or to read about it, and then kind of have you give me your expert analysis as we go. I feel even better about this case now. This is now one of my favorite Canadian cases.
It's a pretty decent case, and it's more than 50 years old now, so it's almost ancient history. And yet, it was investigated in great detail at the time. We have documentation, and we've got, videos of the site and photographs from the site, and we've got, audio recordings and interviews. So it's a very well documented case, and should rightly be one of the great ones for Canada.
All right. Well, Chris, this has been great. We'll do it again soon. We should pick another case like this, a UFO case that's lesser known, and just go right through it, because this is a good way to revisit these.
And it's something, there's a lot of people, I won't call them noobs, but I just did, who are really into, the UFO thing, and they're, fascinated with what's going on in the States, and they're following Skinwalker Ranch on TV and all this sort of stuff. But if you don't know the history, you don't know the text, the context, and some of the cases that already have, cases where pilots got close to UFOs and reported them, and it's been investigated on radar and all this sort of stuff. There's lots of cases like that occurred before this current interest, and I think you really need to know.
I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of Nighttime. I hope you enjoyed learning about this lesser known but absolutely fascinating piece of Canadian history. Now I'm going to start wrapping up the episode, but before I do, let me end with thanks. First, a huge thanks to Chris Rutkowski for joining us and sharing his expertise on this topic. A big thanks to Monty Data, who contributes the music for this show, and Linz from the Dystopian Simulation podcast, who provides my intro and outro voiceovers. But then lastly, and most importantly, a massive thank you goes out to each and every one of you listening to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to the premium feed, Desiree, Stacy, and Bonnie. We appreciate you. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show, you can do it in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple bucks a month, and that money will fund the creation of new episodes. But the premium feed will also give you those new episodes 2 days early, give them to you ad-free, and give you access to a back catalog of Nighttime episodes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can find the premium feed at nighttimepodcast.com/subscribe. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support the show by sharing this episode on social media and letting your like-minded friends know why they should listen. If anyone out there has any story ideas, wants to give feedback on the show, or would like to submit a question or comment to be aired and responded to in an upcoming episode, you can do all that and more at nighttimepodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you, but until then, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte.
Only other thing that I want to ask, is there anything that you know of in the area of his farm, like airports, military bases? Is there anything around there that could have caused an issue? As far as I know, this is the middle of nowhere.
It is. It's a fairly isolated place. You have to want to go there. But there are things like, I think Yorkton had a base, air base at one time. And there's a place, I'm trying to remember the name of the town. Can't remember now, but it was they launched weather balloons from there, fairly the really large ones. So I don't know, off-course balloons. I don't know.
Yeah, 5 off-course balloons.
Yeah,
it's so hard. That's such a mystery. Usually, I can come up with a good explanation for it. In this case, I'm going to have to rule this aliens.
Okay.
And they were investigating a swamp in Saskatchewan, and I don't blame you.
Yeah.